Good morning from Florence and welcome to the second episode of the Max Weber Interviews series 2020-21, where we exchange opinions and insights with distinguished scholars from multiple disciplines within the social sciences. I'm Donato Di Carlo and I'm a political economist and Max Weber Fellow in the SPS department, where I conduct research at the crossroads between European integration and national models of capitalism, with a focus on the role of the state in industrial relations and wage bargaining. I'm joined by my colleague and friend Sebastian Diessner, a Max Weber Fellow from the Robert Schuman Center, working on the politics of macroeconomic policy and central banking. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Professor Vivien Schmidt for a conversation about their latest book, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. Vivien Schmidt is Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and founding director of the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University. She's author of several books and articles on the topic of European integration, as well as models of capitalism in Europe. We are very excited about this opportunity today. And, as you can see, we bought the book shortly after it came out and used the time during quarantine to read it cover to cover and reflect about Europe's multiple crises. Allow me to say that we think it's an excellent book which covers the responses to the Eurozone crisis and the legitimacy issues which emerged as a result of Europe defaulting into governing by rules and having to rule by numbers. Sebastian, please, I leave the floor to you to ask a first question to Professor Schmidt.
Introduction and hi also from my side to everyone, especially to Vivien Schmidt. And we had a book roundtable yesterday in which we explored some of the key themes of the book in depth. And so this interview gives us an opportunity also to have a conversation about some of the bigger questions. And maybe as a first big question to start with, a decade now after the global financial and Eurozone crises, what is maybe the biggest lesson we have learned or yet to learn about Europe and its legitimacy in your view? And perhaps even more interestingly, or as interestingly, what's the biggest or most surprising lesson that you've learned when researching and writing the book?
So I suppose the main lesson is that legitimacy is a precious commodity for governments and indeed for supranational bodies as well. It's actually not so easy to lose, but once it starts eroding, it's also very hard to get back. But one needs to ask, what is legitimacy then? And in the book and in my discussion yesterday, I defined two ways of thinking about legitimacy. One is as governing authority, and the other as governing activities. Governing authority is the very basic one that people use, the Weberian concept of public consent, public trust in a governing body. But how do you get, how do you make, how do you retain governing authority? Well, a lot of it has to do with governing activities. And these governing activities, as I mentioned in the book and last time, have to do with three things. One is performance, output legitimacy, which is also what both of you do, political economy for the most part in the context of the Eurozone crisis. But it's not only output legitimacy, there's also input legitimacy, which is about political participation, citizen representation, but also, and importantly, especially in the case of supranational authorities like this, it's governing elites' political responsiveness to the concerns and the desires of the citizens, even if they're not directly able to represent their views. And finally, the third kind of governing activity is what I call throughput legitimacy, which is about accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness, all normative standards, but then also a technical one is efficacy. And all of these are tremendously important as well. And this is where you lose legitimacy first in one or another of these governing activities, which then can have a negative impact on governing authority. So then what was my biggest surprise and biggest lesson? Well, you think about, I developed these concepts prior to the Eurozone crisis, or perhaps just as they were starting, but I'd been working on questions of legitimacy for a while. And then the Eurozone crisis hits. And now here was the chance to do it. And there are two reasons I looked at the Eurozone crisis. One, obviously, I think as most people, I was obsessed by it and very upset by it. But also because it also seemed to bring everything together. All of my interests over a long academic career, I've always been focused on political economy and done a lot of work on that, also on issues of politics, but also governance. And what was interesting to me, and perhaps surprising, is that in explanations or accounts of the crisis, you mainly got studies that were very, very separate. You either had studies of the political economy and wonderful books that focused on the political economy, Adam Tooze, Ashoka Modi, Mark Blythe, sort of one of the first, and many others. But they were mainly focused on the political economy and on output or lack of output legitimacy, bad performance. There were those who focused on the politics, looking at the rise of populism, the rise of anti-system parties, as in Jonathan Hopkins' new book, and all of that. Or they were focused on governance. But then the governance was sort of all, either studies of accountability, transparency, perhaps efficacy, but none put it together. So in a way, my biggest surprise was not only that these kinds of tools for analysis I had been developing for legitimacy actually seemed to work, but that they actually helped me understand the crisis better. And they ended up being a lens through which to actually look at the crisis and pull it all together and look at all different aspects. And as I said yesterday in my presentation, when I started, I was focused primarily on the political economy and performance, and obviously on the other things, but that's where I started working. By the end of the project, i.e. taking quite a while, I realized that looking at governance at the end didn't make sense, because actually I was really focused on throughput legitimacy. And the surprise there is, or not the surprise, but sort of what I came to see is, whereas in the Eurozone crisis, I suppose output legitimacy comes first, even though I think, generally speaking, input legitimacy is the most important thing. So political legitimacy is key. But what you see is the problems of performance hit first. And then immediately you get the political problems that follow. We get deteriorating economics, increasingly toxic politics, but why? And it's actually about the governance processes. It's not simply the policies, the content of the policies, but the way in which these processes start. And this is about the kind of top-down governance, the governing by rules and ruling by numbers that couldn't work, that didn't work, and then everything follows. So in a way, even if the hierarchy normally is input, output, throughput in terms of what comes first, in the case of the Eurozone crisis, it's actually the throughput, lack of legitimacy, the procedural problems that end up causing the problems of, the lack of effective policies and performance, and then of course the rise of populist extremes in response. So that's
fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So as we are talking about politics, governance, and throughput legitimacy, my second question pertains to the early days of the EMU, when attempts were made to ensure the coordination of fiscal, monetary, and wage policies through the macroeconomic dialogue, as we know, between the social partners, governments, and the ECB. In hindsight, this initiative failed and economic divergence built up, among the Eurozone countries, and painful internal devaluations and fiscal austerity, which you aptly described in the third part of the book, aimed at reversing these diverging trends. As of today, do you think that initiatives like the macroeconomic dialogue may be pertinent in the age of secular stagnation? And wouldn't you agree that supranational coordination, I'm thinking here of wage and social policy, or why not, even health policy today, may be a means for Europe to regain both throughput and output legitimacy? Do you see it as a chimera, or are there ways in which this could be engineered in Europe today?
Okay, so there are two ways that I have of responding to this. And actually it takes me out of the strict political economy sphere into the politics sphere and really issues of democracy. And one of the major problems for the EU over the long haul is what in the book I call its split level legitimacy, that input and output, that output and throughput, so the sort of issues of performance tied to, well, legitimate issues of legitimacy tied to performance and to the procedures at the EU level and at the national level is the political legitimacy. Citizens vote at the national level, their key identity is national, even though you can talk about an increasing European sense of identity, it's generally secondary. All of that suggests that democracy, as we think of it, is at the national level. And will remain there even though the EU is itself democratic. But it's this strange creature that we all know about that some call sui generis and, you know, an unidentified political object, in the words of Jacques Delors, etc. But I think we need to recognize that the democracy is there. So there are two ways to go. You're asking, could we raise all of the things that are at the national level to the EU level for more legitimacy? But remember, the dilemma for the EU is that the more you remove decisions and policymaking to the EU level, the more you impoverish national democracy, because the kinds of debates, the kind of democratic dialogue, democratic debates are national. So the question is, do we move everything up to the EU level, or do we have a kind of a two-level system where you continue to have economic dialogue and wage and social policy coordination at the national level, but you have an EU that makes that possible? And what we've seen over the past number of years is, as EU integration via the Eurozone crisis is integrated, it's done it in a way that has diminished democracy at the national level, or political economic democracy, if you will. You know, especially in Southern Europe, smashing unions and insisting that unions be smashed, cutting welfare states, but in other countries too that were not necessarily under the diktats of the Troika, what you saw is the sort of massive push toward austerity and the one-size-fits-all policies that basically assumed, sort of neoliberal ideas and all of that, basically assumed you need to deregulate labor markets and rationalize the welfare state. Highly problematic, also because it was uneven. You did not do that in Northern Europe, at least in the high value-added manufacturing sector, although you did do it in services. But I mean, the result is that what you see is that social dialogue became almost impossible at the national level in those countries under pressure from the markets and, of course, the European semester process. At the same time that, you know, that Northern Europe didn't have that same pressure, although you saw certain kinds of deregulation in some sectors and not in others. And of course, rising inequality as a result, and dualization of labor markets between, you know, high wage and low wage, you know, temporary and permanent workers, et cetera. All of those are national problems. And to say that there's an EU level solution assumes that everyone can do the same sorts of things. But of course, what we know is, and you certainly know, national varieties of capitalism are very different. You know, in way back when I did my book on the futures of European capitalism, I essentially argued there are at least 3 varieties, but you know, I'm not limiting it to 3, but certainly Northern European coordinated, so-called coordinated market economies are very different than liberal market economies, are very different from what I call state-influenced market economies. And Southern Europe and France certainly require more state influence and more state investment, state-led policies, in fact. State-enhanced capitalism is what you find there, which is very different from the kinds of setup that you have in other countries, in Northern Europe in particular, but also, say, Anglo-sphere countries. And then you can go on to differences amongst those countries. So my problem, and I do talk about it in the book, one of my problems with the Eurozone crisis, but even before with the European semester, and all assumptions, is the assumptions, one, that you could govern by rules and numbers, that, you know, that numerical targeting could work, and 2, that that this was fine at the EU level, that you should do that. So my recommendations in the conclusion is that you need to, you know, decentralize, deconcentrate. You need to go back to allowing the national level to do what they, you know, they're the ones who know best how to make their economies grow. And so in my final recommendations, I said, you know, rather than have fiscal austerity hawks that are using, well, hoax is good too, but anyway, fiscal austerity hawks who are at the national level in these fiscal councils or in national competitiveness councils, you know, where they're essentially following, here are the guidelines, it's all about fiscal consolidation, not thinking about industrial strategy, industrial policy, etc. It has been a disaster on the assumption that all countries grow in the same way. They grow in very different ways. And so you know, as I'm writing this book, or as I'm publishing the book, the pandemic hits. And what's really fascinating about the pandemic is we get a complete shift in recommendations, and they follow exactly the sorts of things that I was suggesting. I'm obviously not the only one, but I've been saying this for a number of years now, that what you needed to do is flip the European semester. And instead of having it appear as hierarchical top down, this is what the EU is telling us to do, with, you know, headline goals of fiscal consolidation and structural reform that in 2011 said crush the unions, cut welfare. But by 2014 said, talk to the social partners, do whatever you can, and think about inequality and poverty. Whew, finally, they get back to, but you know, the headline goal in those first 5 years was always fiscal consolidation first. So even though the structural reform recommendation shifted, you don't necessarily see any changes there. 2015 and on, things change, no question, to some extent. But you know, for those countries without the so-called fiscal space, they can't do much of anything. So, so at the national level, to now really answer directly your question, at the national level, give back to the national level what it can do best. Turn the fiscal councils into industrial policy councils, turn the, you know, saying sort of giving general guidelines of what you can do, what you ought to be doing at the national level, and turn these competitive councils into industrial policy councils, but democratize them. Make it not just experts and government officials, but bring in the social partners, bring in civil society to have general discussion of how to, you know, you think back, de Gaulle set up the sort of le plan and had regional planning councils. And this was all to bring the force vive back into the discussion. And actually, you know, it's about providing money for investment, but essentially having people talk to one another. So that's really what I'm talking about. Rather than having a top down, this is what you do, have a sort of a national level or even regional level discussions, or even cross-regional if we talk about various kind of cross-border regional areas that are so successful, as in Bavaria and Northern Italy and Lombardy, or other places. You see it on the French-Spanish border as well, or on the French-German border, and you see it elsewhere. But have these kinds of discussions about how best to operate at the same time that then the EU level needs to provide the kind of investment and help. And that is what we've seen in the pandemic. So EU level investment. And then one last thing, which speaks directly to your mentioning the macroeconomic dialogue. In my talk to the European Parliament yesterday, and I have to admit, I came up with this at my very last minute, but I ended up saying in my concluding remarks, how do we democratize sort of the EU and make the ECB more accountable? But in the back of my mind, it's also what I've been suggesting. How do you have a macroeconomic dialogue, a serious macroeconomic dialogue at the EU level that talks about how you move forward? In particular, in this, Sebastian, is more, your area in terms of the ECB, but, the ECB needs guidance on the secondary objectives. All it does is talk about price stability, but creeping into it increasingly is, what does price stability mean if the economies are all going to hell and the Eurozone is going to explode? So it's been doing more and more on the secondary objectives, often without saying it. Behind closed doors in their coordinative discourse amongst policymakers, they are talking about it. You can see it in the various reports, in the discussions among central bankers. But you don't see it in the public. I was just watching Christine Lagarde and her chief economist on one of these ECB listens, and they're still talking, or in speeches, they're still talking price stability. And yet all of these how do you get the ECB to be, but also to know what to do in terms of which secondary objectives to choose, how to ensure, how do you democratize that? It seems to me a kind of great macroeconomic dialogue would do that. But, it's more than simply giving advice to the ECB. It's also giving direction to the EU as a whole. And this is about essentially trying to reproduce at the EU level something that you have at the national level. During election times, or even not, you have national discussions about where the country is going. Generally, in national level, it's about electoral politics. And it's about who's going to win and who got which program, and you have big debates over which economic program would work. And then someone wins and they institute, that program. Well, that doesn't work at the EU level. It's not going to do it for any time soon. But what you could have is yearly great macroeconomic dialogues talking about what direction are we going, what is the state of the economy today. You bring in the ECB, but the Commission, member state leaders as European leaders, but also as national leaders. Obviously, the European Parliament would play a major role in this. But if you start thinking about, so what are the grand strategies for the future, and do it each year, you have a kind of democratizing effect because of the EU level dialogue. So it no longer looks like technocrats are making policy for everyone. They still are, actually, but at least there will be some basis upon which they can do this, so that they're not these autonomous, completely independent, off somewhere deciding what's good for the world, but that they're much, much more connected to what goes on. And this also is important because then everyone's views get heard, but then the idiocy, some of their views, excuse me, but that's actually, ordoliberalism, for example, that has been a massive problem for the Eurozone forever, was never discussed. It was baked in from the Bundesbank, it's baked into the ECB, and where are we now? Actually now, finally with COVID, it seems to have broken that, but you need, these kinds of arguments need to be articulated, need to be discussed, just as the continued obsession with for debt, about how terrible debt is something that also should be addressed and never is. And in 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden the Austerian hawks will be back. You need publications, because the Austerian hawks can say, look, here, these are the rules. The rules need to be reformed. All of that needs to have major discussion. Why not do it EU level, but have it as a democratized function at the EU level? So maybe in a way, this is exactly what you're asking. Macroeconomic dialogue, EU level. Does that work for wage bargaining? I think is a big question. And I'm not sure, because given how diverse labor markets are in different countries, I think what one needs to do is, rather than saying we're going to have supranational coordination here, you could certainly do it sector by sector. But what you might also say is leave the national level to have its own decisions, at the same time that perhaps more can be done at the EU level. But, judging from what we've seen so far, I don't have much hopes on that. Business is always much more powerful than labor, especially at this point in time where labor is, almost toothless everywhere.
I think one can hardly disagree with that. Yes, maybe just to pick up on one of these points, that you were indeed yesterday invited to testify in the European Parliament. And so maybe on the prospects of supranational coordination, it will maybe be difficult to involve all stakeholders. But if we went one by one, and if we went with the ECB, for example, and its current strategy review and the listens events and so on, what would need to be maybe the outcome of that process, or what would have to be some of the ingredients so that we could say this is something that does enhance throughput and maybe even input legitimacy, if we see some inputs actually being taken up, or is this just a nice start, but we shouldn't expect too much from it? Just from your maybe also experience yesterday of the conversation in Parliament.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's really important to say about the ECB from the start is that it has made amazing progress. If we go back to the early years, Wim Duisenberg or Jean-Claude Trichet, there's a massive, an obsession with credibility. And what credibility meant, not talking, yes, they did talk, but, basically saying, we're independent, we don't listen to anyone, and non-transparent, no one knew what went on. And what you saw is increasingly they became more transparent and became concerned increasingly about accountability. Now, this goes along with a trend in central banks generally to talk more. The ECB still, I think, talks less than others, but it's certainly, but you can tell me probably better than I about that. But it's becoming increasing, it's getting a sense of accountability. And in the book I talk about, I have one chart that shows you sort of the change in the discourse over time, where with Trichet, it's all about credibility, and Draghi comes in fall 2011, and he still talks about credibility, but credibility drops almost completely out of sight, almost immediately. And the shift, the main term then is stability in the medium term. Why stability in the medium term? Because that enables them to bring in all the other considerations. And I mean, it's twofold, because credibility stops you from talking to others politically, but it also keeps you harnessed to a very narrow interpretation of the rules. And Draghi increasingly and necessarily reinterprets the rules. And here, I make a point that there are different ways of reinterpreting the rules by stealth. The Commission basically hid what it did with a discourse that contradicted what it was actually doing. So I call them in sort of the Ayatollahs of austerity. And in that phase, in these first years, there was a harsh discourse of austerity and structural reform. And they did that from 2010 to 2012. But then they started easing the rules. And the same commissioner, Olli Rehn, continued to speak of harsh austerity and structural reform, even as the Commission was giving derogations to the rules, increasingly. You know, derogations for Italy and for France and Italy twice, for Spain for recalculating what the structural deficit was. I mean, all of this, but Olli Rehn's discourse didn't change. The ECB hid its reinterpretation of the rules in plain view, because Draghi kept saying we're doing everything in our mandate, as he went from Trichet's very strict interpretation of the rules. We're not a lender of last resort, you know, we're only dealing with inflation. This is about credibility, to moving to we'll do whatever it takes within our mandate, he says, but the market is stop attacks, so that's fine, to quantitative easing and preparing more kinds of LTROs, et cetera, which shows you. And so this was about recognizing the accountability of the central bank, the need to do something, you know, output performance. You know, my God, if the euro explodes, where's your performance? But also throughput legitimacy, a way of trying to say, we're reinterpreting the rules. But how do you legitimize that? You tell the public why it's legitimate in public communications, but you do that in particular for the ECB, you have a form of accountability, which is the European Parliament. And the ECB increasingly, and you can even look at, if you look at the ways in which the ECB responds in the European Parliament, it becomes much more responsive, at least expansive in terms of what it says and how it says, what it does in its reports, etc. But it listens, not only listens, but it hears. Or if it hears, it listens. You know, it doesn't matter which one uses. But there you see an increasing difference. You know, one would need to do a serious content analysis of the discourse of ECB presidents over time to think about how to demonstrate rigorously how accountability improves over time, but simply just in the kinds of discourse it does. And in the current strategy review and ECB Listens events, it's quite clear that the ECB is trying to do something, is trying to find ways to legitimate its reinterpretation of the rules, and also to enable it to do more. And this is, and in the EP I talked about this, but it's something that never gets discussed. We always think of accountability as political accountability, you know, to a legislative forum. But it's also about accountability to technical forums. And for the ECB, for any central banker, you are concerned not simply about what the politicians are going to say. Anyway, they don't know anything about, you know, we know that they don't know anything about central banking policy, and they'll basically accept most of it if you say it, if you say it in a way that they can understand. And anyway, what can they say? You know, no, you didn't do that. Yeah. But the accountability is very much in the technical forms of accountability. This is Jackson Hole, you know, in Wyoming, the yearly August meetings, where all of the central bankers all show up to give speeches, but also to talk to one another, to legitimate themselves professionally in terms of what they're doing. That's really important. And here what you see is the ECB was actually very much out of step with other central banks in those early years. In 2008, the Fed and also the ECB sort of joined into fiscal stimulus, But the ECB kept saying, oh, but we're different, our mandate, we can't do what you do. And very, very quickly, whereas quantitative easing in massive ways, the ECB shut down and turned to austerity and structural reform. And in fact, when I talk about the ECB, I ask, is it the hero of the crisis in terms of legitimacy or the ogre? And in fact, and I think, Sebastian, you're the one who commented, is both things at the same time. And it's continued to be, but not only because of the structure and the rules, the legal mandate, but also because it's, you know, what it did was it was both the hero, but at the same time that it was saving the euro, it said, oh, but we can only do this if the rest of you go and do austerity. And it was austerity, if you remember, in 2010, it's austerity for everyone, not simply for the countries in trouble. And it was Germany that first says, yes, we're going to tighten our belt. Schwabian housewife, we know we can't overspend. You know, tighten your belt when there's little money in the household. You know, perfect ordoliberal stability, seemingly common sense, completely anti-Keynesian, anti-everything we've learned about what you do in a recession. And in this context, what you saw at the same time as the hero. But what we also see is slowly but surely, especially under Draghi, the ECB tries to move away from that. The ECB slowly but surely tries to move to quantitative easing in 2015 and other things, and continues to think about it. And this has to do, to my mind, with conversations within this larger epistemic community of what I've been calling its technical accountability forum. But this is where central bankers know that they can get new ideas, they can learn from one another, they can develop innovative, and now in a time of greater central bank activism, that's essentially what's going on. So, you know, back to the question about the strategy, current strategy review, my sense is that this becomes another way of legitimizing, of appearing more accountable by saying, here we're reviewing with these recommendations that will enable the ECB to reinterpret its, you know, its mandate yet again, but now probably in a more transparent way, in plain view, and move forward. And I think the ECB listens events are, you know, also, you know, contribute to that. That's about, you know, I guess accountability in the form of public opinion, which is to try to say, okay, we're not simply talking to technical actors or to the politicians, but also to the people, and here civil society groups. So I ended up listening in to some of the ECB listens, their first October 21st meeting, and it's fascinating. So there you've got Lagarde, and you've got Lane, so ECB President Lagarde and Philip Lane, chief economist. And there, what was really interesting, and you just have to look at this, is, you know, and then I read a number of ECB speeches, but in the ECB listens, you have really powerful critiques of ECB policies. You know, some people saying that it's a problem for savers. You know, we've heard that from the German side as well before, against quantitative easing. But you also had people from Finance Watch, from Green, civil society groups, et cetera, saying, you know, what are you going to do more? You know, how are we going to bring in, you know, what do you do about green bonds or bond neutral, you know, getting beyond neutral bond buying in order to deal, you know, not buying from the carbon, you know, fossil fuel industry, because obviously that goes against the whole notion of the green transition. What do you do about inequality, they raised? And what was fascinating was seeing the responses. Christine Lagarde avoided any controversial question. Someone, you know, in these 5 questions raised by these 5, for example, in these 5 groups, she raises the issue of transparency, because Transparency International raised a question about whistleblowers, and she said, I'm very happy to announce blah, blah. And then the next time she said, someone raised culture. Oh, it's wonderful that culture comes in. Avoiding on any of the economic questions, she turns to Philip Lane. And then Philip Lane doesn't really respond. He certainly is not going to say, yes, we're going to buy green bonds. I don't think anyone mentioned helicopter money, but there was a question, how can you do something directly for the citizens, which I think was behind that. So I think it's going to take some time. The ECB listens as the ECB listens. Does it necessarily respond? We'll see. But certainly looking at speeches by members of the governing board, going out and telling people, it's okay, our pandemic response is good. They focused almost exclusively on price stability, which means the discourse, is still on the primary objective and not on the secondary.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, throughput and input legitimacy is increasing, and it's encouraging, but it may take some time for us to see how all of this ends up affecting bank policy.
Indeed. Thank you so much. I think we might have time for just the last question or so before we need to close, but I'll leave it then also to Donato to take the floor there. But thanks very much for the very, very insightful response.
Sebastian, I was thinking, because we know that Vivien has a very tight schedule and we want to give her a break before her next meeting in 15 minutes. Perhaps we could avoid asking last question and end the interview here. What do you say?
Actually,
yes.
No, I have one, I will respond. I mean, there's one thing I'd like to say, which is, I think was the last question that you might have wanted to ask. I'll make it very short. But what about Europe's legitimacy in light of the ongoing COVID-19 induced crisis?
Yes, there has to be a COVID question, yes.
Yeah, I think I've got to say something about COVID. And it's important to note that the book goes to press just as COVID hits. But subsequently, I've been looking at the COVID-19 crisis and asking, thrilled actually with the COVID-19 response in terms of the economics. I mean, first, obviously, worried because it looked like the Eurozone crisis, déjà vu, doing the same things all over again, i.e. not responding appropriately, in particular the ECB with Christine Lagarde saying, oh, we can't do anything to deal with the German-Italian bond spreads. That's not our job. And then, of course, she quickly walks that back within, over the weekend, and then you get the big pandemic emergency purchase program that was significant. But it's not just the ECB did. What the ECB did, we could argue, is just incremental change. Very important, but it was moving in that direction in any case. But it's EU level debt. That is a break in the taboo. To my mind, this is a paradigm shift that hopefully will last. I mean, I know that we said in 2008, 2009 that this was a paradigm shift. But I think this time, the temporary fund could very easily become a permanent fund. There's a recognition that everyone needs to spend much more, and spend in terms of productive debt, good investments for the future, and that there's an EU level capacity that was not there before. I think that changes the game. That's a game changer, completely, a paradigmatic shift. I think there's a lot of work to make sure that this little core idea in this paradigmatic shift really develops. But I think this is the beginning of the beginning. And maybe the end of the last phase. I think we're seeing a major shift. We all hoped that this was the case with the financial crisis and then the Eurozone crisis as it was hitting, and it wasn't. It was back to the same old. But this time, I don't think there's any going back. Among other things, everyone has spent way too much. The Eurozone deficit and debt rules are basically gone, suspended. There's lots of talk about how to reform them. I've been pleased to note that top economists like Olivier Blanchard are making recommendations in the same direction that I've been, which is he's talking about standards, getting away from governing by rules and numbers. I think we're going to see lots more discussion of that. But in any case, those rules are going to be reformed. And I think the whole discussion is gone. You know, one last note that Wolfgang Schäuble, former German finance minister and one of the major people behind the Eurogroup's dictatorship. I think when I talked about the commission, I asked, was it a dictatorship or a mutually deliberative body? Certainly the Eurogroup in the Troika and in many other cases was a dictatorship. And he was the German leader of that Eurogroup dictatorship, certainly in the very he has said we're not going back. Has said and that it's necessary, and that the future clearly is how do you confront climate change? How do you deal with inequalities? What do we do about the digital transition? All of this is key. And so I think with that note, I think I can end.
The beginning of a new beginning, perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Professor Schmidt, thank you very much. This was fantastic, and it was a pleasure to have you talk to us. We wish you all the best, and we look forward to reading your next book then.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you both. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.